Hey everybody. So we're going to be looking here at a lot of this is really like independence movements in these regions: Latin America, Australia, colonization of Australia, sort of the government in Australia, Canada, those regions. This would also be where we talk about the United States, North America, our country, but I'm not going to be spending any time on that. That would be something you look at in an American history class, so I'm really not going to be covering much of that. Okay. So, origins of revolutions against colonial powers. So at the start of this period, Spain controls almost all of the Americas in this time period. Other than east coast of North America and some parts of really high North America, Canada regions, but almost all of the rest of the Americas, the western part of North, Central Latin America, Spain is in control of most of it. So we're going to sort of look at these rebellions. We're going to look at some of these rebellions that happened in the Spanish colonies. And eventually, in a period of 100 years, we see pretty much all of the Spanish Empire overthrown in the Americas. Charles III of Spain, this is somewhere early 1800s. Charles III of Spain, he established several separate regions in the New World. And these will really become countries, but really for them, they're more regional governments. As they broke up the Americas into different sections. We have these regional spheres, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, and there's others. And the idea was, what they did was they put each one of these regions under like a local control, a local authority, which was semi-autonomous. They still owed allegiance to the Spanish crown, but they were sort of autonomous. Because it was so far away. I mean, this was the other side of the world from Spain. So these local governors, these sometimes like viceroyals, viceroyals they'd be called, they had almost total autonomy to run their regions of the Americas how they saw fit. This gives this government much greater control to run it their own way. Each one's run different. They're all supposed to generally follow a Spanish model of colonization, this mission model, which is something I really covered in previous chapter or previous course, in the early world course. We sort of talk about the mission model, but they're given a lot of freedom to sort of run it the way they feel best. Now, colonial manufacturing was very devastated. You got to understand, Spain had almost uncontested control of the Americas for over 300 years. And generally, before the 1700s, Spain was the dominant world power with trade, shipping, things like this. Largely funded by all the silver they were pulling out of the Americas. So for many years, they were the uncontested sort of the world power outside of Europe. Well, with the establishment of more and more free trade, many more countries getting involved, the massive expansion of trade, all things we've covered in previous chapters, this really hurts the colonies. This really hurts their ability to keep up and compete. It was very difficult. So with these products made in the colonies, they couldn't compete with products actually being made they couldn't compete with products actually being shipped into the colonies from other places, because these goods were being produced so cheaply. What generally was happening, as I covered before, raw materials are shipped from the world to Europe and produced in Europe plants and factories with really cheap labor. It was actually cheaper to take the raw materials from the New World, ship them to Spain, make manufactured goods, and then ship them back to the New World, than actually cheaper and more efficient and higher production than just manufacturing them in the New World in the first place. I know it might not make sense, but it is. It was. Mass scale, it was actually cheaper to do the whole roundabout process than just to leave it and build it right there. Plus, the other advantage was the more shipping was done, the more taxes the government could pull off of all these, because every time it was processed, it was pulled, it was shipped, it was reprocessed, shipped back across the Atlantic. Every step along the way, the government could tax it. And so this was bringing in tons of revenue. And the colonies couldn't really compete with this. The tax that they had to pay in the first place and the goods were just, they just couldn't really compete with it. It was actually more expensive to buy homemade goods than just to buy the cheaper imported stuff. We actually see something like that here in America now. Oftentimes, it's more expensive to buy American-made goods than to buy something made in China. It just is. We all see that all the time. So it's really not that much different, really. Also, all kinds of taxes. As I said, all kinds of export, import taxes. This really devastated the economies. For many years, they had been able to be self-sufficient and working with a more fair trade system. And by the 1800s, they simply can't keep up, which causes the actual colonies to go into decline. Makes it much more expensive. Then you have all these international conflicts, which we've covered in previous chapters. There's always something going on. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish-American War, which happens at the end of this century. All of these things really meant that Latin American lands could change hands at a moment's notice. You literally could be walking around in your Latin American country or your American region, and today you would be part of Spain, and 5 years down the line you could be part of France, and 20 years down the line you might be part of the U.S. You never really knew. The way things were so chaotic globally with all the conflicts, Spain was at war with them, France was at war with them, England was at war with everybody. You just never really knew who you actually owed allegiance to. So constantly changed rulership, constantly changing loyalties. This also causes neglect from the European powers neglecting the colonies, because there just was no stability. It was sort of anarchy almost at times. So this actually fosters independence, self-rule, self-government. These regions in the Americas, as I already pointed out there up on one, they were often semi-autonomous in the first place, because the actual powers they owed allegiance to was on the other side of the world. They might hear from them once a year, or twice, once every other year or something. So this sort of helps with the independence movements. It does. See what else you want to say here. Racial, ethnic, class issues. This was common. Racial, ethnic, class issues causing discontent. Mixing of Native Americans, Indians, with whites, with blacks. You see this constant racial intermixing. Again, many of these places in the colonies had whites. Again, Spanish or white. Spanish or white. So you got the white Spaniards coming in. You have black slaves brought in. You have all the native, indigenous Native American populations, which they themselves are pretty diverse. Many different languages. It creates this incredible hodgepodge of white, black, brown, different religions, different languages, different traditions and cultures. It's quite an interesting. America is quite an interesting mix of all of this. All these mixed bloodlines. It brings all kinds of complications to society. It's not clear who's always in charge, what the different class structure is. It's not always clear what the ranking system is. Sure, brand new people that show up on a ship, it's pretty obvious who they are, white, black, brown. But when they're people who've been there for generations and the bloodlines mix, skin colors change, it's hard to really know who's what and where you fit into the system, which makes it really difficult. Causes all kinds of challenges. There were many like the Native Americans were the most common population. Of course, they were the majority. But the pure Spanish were usually this Creole, the ruling elite, were usually the ones that were more had more power, more authority. They were usually the ones that had the ability to run The Creole is basically anyone Native American mixed with European blood. So Spanish anything of the Americas is Creole. Mestizo is just a mixture, basically any mixture, white, black, brown, Native American, African, European. It's sort of a mixture. It can apply to almost any sort of racial mixture. Well, the ruling elite in almost every colony was always a Creole, European something. So it would be Spanish, Native American, Spanish, African. It would be whatever that was. But one of the ways you usually had the elite status or the higher status that gave you authority was often because of the lighter skin tones, and also that you could trace your bloodline to original Spanish settlers, which gave you an advantage. But the thing is, that was a very small number. The majority of people were not Spanish, were not descended from the Spanish. The majority of the people were descended from Native Americans. This caused a lot of animosity, it caused frustration, caused anger at the different class levels. Final factor was some of these Enlightenment ideals. There's a lot of these Enlightenment ideals from Europe. Again, all these Europeans coming over, all these Spanish people coming over, brings over these ideas of freedom rights, opportunities, the natural rights, all the kind of stuff we've seen that I mentioned before in other chapters, that the more the Europeans come over, they bring over their knowledge with them, bring over their books with them, they bring over their learning with them. And much of this Enlightenment ideals is about freedom and equality and independence and rights of man. Well, Europeans, of course, considered it rights of the white man, Spanish, the rights of the Spanish man. But when other people hear the ideas, they're like, why does it just apply to them? Why shouldn't it apply to us? Why shouldn't it apply to the Native Americans? Why shouldn't it apply to the Mestizo? Why shouldn't it apply to Africans? Voltaire and Rousseau in the colonies. That's part of the thing that led us to have our colonies, which becomes the United States. Certainly different issues, but still these Enlightenment ideas, which make people think, maybe we don't have to be oppressed and ruled by someone from across the ocean. Maybe we could rule ourselves. Before independence, Spanish colonies, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which this becomes largely Mexico, Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Viceroyalty of Brazil, that's Portugal, that's Portuguese. You can see how large these territories are. Latin America today is made up of about 20 different countries. How many different regions? South America. South America is made up of about 20 different countries. What do you have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 5 maybe? Different regions here. So these are huge areas. This gives you an idea what we're talking about here. By 1900, pretty much, as we're going to talk about this in the coming sections, by 1900, most of these are independent. Most of these have achieved independence by the early 1900s. And then you have the silver mines here, what becomes Mexico. This was the sort of the cornerstone of the Spanish wealth. All these silver that they were pulling out of here. For many years, they controlled the silver flow across the world. And it made Spain wealthy. 1830, colonial independence. We see places here, colonial independence, Latin America, 1780, 1830. We see lots of places here, 1825, Bolivia and Peru. We see the Spanish hold falling apart. Mexico declares it by 1821. So we see lots of this, declaring independence and moving into independent territory, declaring freedom, resistance, rebellion, independence. Andean Indians, Andes Mountains, South America. We see these rebellions against Spain. They're frequent. Inca, these are the Incan territory. Inca descended ruler Tupac Amaru II. He led a deadly revolt. Potentially 100,000 people died. 100,000 dead. Word of Tupac's revolt led others to do likewise in the Americas. It instilled fear in the Spanish. Very violent. Toussaint, again another one I may pronounce it right. Louverture, Haiti, 1804. Created fears of widespread slave revolts, class warfare. Haiti declared independence. This was the first non-Europeans to win independence from Europe. Declared it 1793, which caused all kinds of issues. Make sure I have the dates right here. Okay, I know what this is. The reason I have two dates here. Declared independence in 93, started a war actually. Wasn't officially declared Haiti until 1804, so it took a while. The U.S. was very concerned about this because this was basically a slave uprising. There had never been a successful slave uprising in the Americas. Not one. There had been many attempts, but never one. And there was never a successful slave uprising in the United States. Never happened. And there were attempts. This was a successful slave uprising. Good for Haiti, yes. Eventually, two scientists actually caught, imprisoned, and executed for what he did for this uprising. But it still got a Haiti independence. 1793 declared, officially recognized in 1804. But of course, the U.S. is concerned because at 1804, this time period, the U.S. slavery is thriving. It's basically the backbone of much of the American economy. And of course, they're worried about, we could have a successful slave uprising right off our coast. Haiti's not far from Florida. And of course, it would be concerning that something like this might spread into the United States. Simon Bolivar, Gran Colombia. He was a Creole, which meant he was part European blood, part European, Spanish, you would assume. He objected to Spanish rule from Spain. His victories over the royal armies, it garnered him the presidency of the Gran Colombia, sort of the region, garnered him presidency over the region, 1819. He was disappointed later, his inability, he couldn't effect a united Pan America. There was a big push all through the 1800s for what they would call Pan America, to create a united government, sort of similar to the United States. It was actually modeled. He wrote about this, and he talked about how it would be modeled on the United States model, without slavery, but on this idea of a bunch of United States creating a grand unified country. This idea of Pan America, mini America, large America, which would have, I guess it would have encompassed much of Central America and South America. There's been a push for that for many years, all through the 1800s, and it failed. It didn't work. He eventually goes into exile and has to flee for his life. Spain didn't give up these territories easily. Oftentimes, even after the war, even after they declared independence, Spain would continue sending armies. They would continue sending ships, invasions. Some of these places declared independence, later to lose it again. Ultimately, they get independence. Ultimately, they all become independent, but some of them gained it and then lost it and then had to gain it back again, because this was the heart of Spanish Empire. Globally, almost all of Spain's eggs in the basket kind of thing, pretty much all of Spain's eggs were in the Americas. This was their revenue, their markets. It's who bought all their Spanish manufactured goods. This was the heart of their empire. And so they fought for these. They sent armies over for these. They sent hundreds of ships over at times to try and retake these ports and to try and control the trade routes. This was incredibly important for Spain. And for almost the entire 19th century, Spain spent the majority of their revenues attempting to control, retake, and dominate the trade markets in and out of the Americas. And it was eventually a losing game. Ultimately, by the 1900, there's about 12 independently recognized nations in Central and South America that all have broken free of the Spanish Empire. It sort of was like when the dam broke. Once there was one, then there was another, news spreads, people hear about it, and it just sort of spreads. Pedro I Brazil. Napoleon invaded Portugal. This would be back in, the early 1800s when he invaded Portugal. The royal family actually fled to Brazil and they reestablished the empire there. So for several years, the crown, the seat of the Portuguese Empire, where the actual royalty and the king lived, wasn't in Portugal. It was in Brazil. They believed they were safer there, fleeing Europe, running from the Napoleon's armies. Since, as we talked about before, pretty much all of Europe fell to Napoleon there in the early 1800s. So they did this. They reestablished the capital. So the capital of Portugal for many years was Rio. This was the capital of Portugal. The government opened the ports to friendly ships, the population. This was all considered under the king's son, Pedro I. And they enjoyed industrial expansion, prosperity, and eventually, interestingly enough, the royal family in Brazil, when the Napoleon's wars are over, the capital readjusts back to Spain, and the royal family that's in Brazil, a part of the royal family, they choose to stay and declare independence, choosing that they are going to be independent. Bear in mind, such as in the case here of Simon Bolivar, Tupac, Pedro, these are often people that have mixed blood, European blood in them, and they're declaring independence as an elite. They're not declaring independence. This isn't a popular uprising. These are not generally popular, poor, farmer, peasant uprisings. These are actually uprisings at the top. Educated, elite, typically Creole, that have chosen because they're educated, they're knowledgeable, they know about these independence ideas, these Enlightenment ideas, they have access to resources, money, they have access to wealth, they already have a lot of connections with the elite among society. They simply decide, we're not going to owe allegiance to the Spanish crown anymore, we're going to be independent. These are not generally popular uprisings from the bottom. This is basically at the top, just choosing, we're going to be the boss now. We're not going to basically listen to Spain anymore. Did life change? And this is probably one of the most significant parts of it. Did life really change for your typical poor person in Central and South America? No, it didn't. Suddenly, freedom from Spain didn't make life better for most people. Most of these countries still were heavily impoverished. They were not industrialized, heavily dependent upon the trade routes. Most South American countries still had some aspect of slavery almost to the end of the century. Many of them didn't actually outlaw slavery to the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. So almost the turn of the 20th century before we see slavery officially ended in mostly South American countries. They were still heavily in debt, impoverished, and the power, the authority, the money, the wealth, the education was still generally concentrated right at the top. So the only thing that really changed is who the boss was, but not really much change for most citizens. These were not your popular uprisings from the bottom up. Now, in this case, because the royal family was here in Brazil, and because they had a lot of these established trade connections with Portugal, and Portugal didn't really fight this. When Brazil declares its independence, Portugal doesn't really push it. First of all, the people declaring independence are actually in the royal bloodline. So, it's, what are you going to do? You're going to wage a war against your brother? I mean, don't get me wrong, royalty's done that. It has happened, of course, but it's not as likely. Plus, Brazil's number one trade partner was still Portugal, so they still kept trading goods back and forth. They still kept an open market. So Portugal still was generating a lot of wealth off of this Brazil, and even once Brazil became independent. So, and Brazil enjoyed a lot of economic prosperity. This Brazilian territory was huge. It was the largest of any territory in South America. So, yeah, interesting. Got that. All right, the aftermath of independence. All right. In most cases, the local indigenous populations know better than they were before. Not much really changes. If you're just a typical farmer, whether you're ruled by the Spanish or a local Creole or whoever, life doesn't really change if you're just a regular person in there. The new masters were the same wealthy elites. They had been the same wealthy elites that are running it before, only they're now technically fully in charge instead of sort of working for the Spanish. We see a lot of political instability. The people at the top enjoyed the wealth, power, and status. That's the reason they were there in the first place. They wanted the wealth, power, status, all of the opportunities that come from being rich and having the connections with the international trade and international markets. So they enjoyed that. Most of these people in the local areas had no experience actually running government. I mean, you got to consider the Spanish authority had been running things for centuries. In some cases here, close to 400 years, 300 years plus. So a lot of these local people didn't necessarily have a lot of experience running government. They didn't understand how to run something as large as, for instance, Brazil, or some of these places were huge. And so they often found themselves vulnerable to attack by their neighboring countries, better organized countries. We even see places where, when Spain's kicked out, we see other European countries coming in and trying to invade and take over. Realizing, hey, there's an opportunity. Spain's gone. Let's go and get that. Because we have the more powerful military, economy, ships, soldiers, etc. France did this. The Netherlands did this. We even did this, as we talked about previously with the Philippines, for instance. So, Mexico, that also Mexico lost half of its territory to us. You got to consider the entire, about a third of the western United States was all Mexico until we took it from them. The entire central United States was all French until we took it from them. So not exactly the same thing, but the reality is, a lot of these places, they got independence and they lost the money, the treasure, the wealth, the military status. Oh, my dog wants up here, so hold on a second. Come on, get up there, lay down. She's cute. She is. So a lot of these places, they lost the ability to really defend themselves efficiently and effectively. When they cut off their ties with Spain, some of them lost access to the markets, of course, but they lost access to military protection, the infrastructure. If Spain was building railroads, they stopped, walked away. They lost access to technology, industrialization, because Spain was industrializing some of these places, at least in regions. In different urban areas, we see this happening because it's to profit Spain. They stopped doing all that. So a lot of these folks, it didn't really work very well for them. A lot of these countries experienced a lot of instability, a lot of civil war, strife. We see military dictatorships take over in many of them. Some finding the only way to control this large population is through military might because they don't have the ability to do it politically. They don't have the knowledge, the savvy, the training, the education to know how to run a government. I don't know how to run a government. You don't know how to run a government. And so they had to resort to basically holding people at gunpoint and basically running things as a military dictatorships. A lot of these independence movements were militarily led. That is interesting to know that too. Generals usually stayed in power. They ruled military. They ruled their populations. General Santa Anna, revolution, revolt, civil war. He takes over Mexico, becomes the president of Mexico. He's a warlord. He's not a politician. He runs Mexico through military might. We see General Paez in Venezuela. Same thing. Running through military might, executions, prison camps. Anyone who speaks out against him, he has killed in the streets. We see this happening pretty common. Coups were common. Bolivia, for instance, is interesting. In Bolivia alone, in the 100 years that we're talking about here, from 1820s until 1914, Bolivia changes authority, changes the power structure 60 times. So that's about little over every year, we see a new leader of Bolivia. There's years we have as many as 3 in 1 year. That is probably the worst, the most extreme example. But all these countries had to do with this kind of stuff. It was violent, war-torn, ugly, and lots of military violence and coups, warlords fighting across the lands. Yeah. Economy was disrupted, farmland destroyed, mines blown up. If I can't have it, he's not going to have it, so I'm going to destroy the mine or flood the mine or burn down the forest. We see everything. Generally, the next 100 years is nothing but chaos and bloodshed across most of Central and South America. The aftermath of colonialism. The Spanish leave and it all comes apart. While the Spanish were bad in many ways, again, it's their colonial oppressors, they did maintain order, they maintained structure, they maintained the peace, even though it might have been through violence at times. They maintained a rigorous system of economy and trade and sort of controlling the population. And when they left, there was no one really well equipped to take over, and it mostly just comes apart. Pretty bad. African, I almost say African Americans. I don't know I guess African American, Central, South America, African Americans. So the Africans that are in the South, they were often very oppressed. Again, slavery still existed in many places in Central and South America. But even where slavery wasn't as common or had been outlawed, some independence movements outlawed slavery. They did. They were still the bottom of the class. Of the caste system, anyone who was Creole or European blood was typically at the top. And then anyone who was mixed Native American was generally in the middle, which was most populations, or pure Native American. And then at the bottom was African, or anyone mixed African blood was typically at the bottom. So even in a society that was so mixed, bloodlines, black people still found themselves at the bottom. It was a color system. Lighter skin at the top, and the darker your skin, you were at the bottom. It was the same there as what we saw in the United States, very similar in this. Light at the top, dark at the bottom. Cuba and Brazil were bad. 1886 for Cuba to free its slaves. Brazil freed slaves in 1888. But your skin color is really what mattered. So the tolerance that we see here, as noted here, applied with skin color. So if you were lighter skin color, you would have better opportunities at the top. But you had to sort of keep it hidden that you were African if you had African blood, because African was still considered at the bottom. But if you could pass as someone who was above that, someone who was lighter skinned, you could actually have a decent amount of success and more opportunity. Your skin color determined, I guess to make it clearer, your skin color determined. But if you did look blacker, you were at the bottom. If you looked whiter, you were at the top. Neocolonialism and socioeconomic effects. The results of these revolutions is often the new countries were dominated by their neighbors. Happened a lot. An example, Mexico's economy. Mexico's economy was based often on American-owned plantations in Mexico. While British and American interests often backed Mexican mining interests and agriculture, it was often financed by American money. So, what does that mean? Bottom line, a lot of the production that happened in Mexico, manufacturing, farms, production, mines, was actually paid for with American money. Why? Many American businessmen, this was during the 1800s when America was expanding, our industrial capacity was expanding, we were going coast to coast, we were rapidly growing. Many people who had newfound wealth, they often invested it in our nearest large neighbor, which was Mexico. Once they freed themselves from Spain in 1822, I think that's the year. Once they were free from Spain, it allowed the United States to have much greater trade. And we started, by the mid-1800s, we're building railroads into Mexico, and we are building factories and plants and plantations and farms in Mexico. And then what the Americans are doing is they're investing millions of dollars to get the profits, expecting that the products and goods much quicker and cheaper to have them shipped up by train than to worry about ships and trade across the oceans. So tons of money was being poured into Mexico by the United States and also by England. We see a lot of that in Central America. England putting money in there. Very simple trade. Very simple. Now we followed this into Brazil, Chile, Argentina, places like this, mining and farming. And most of the profits from this, that's sort of the point of this section, didn't go to the host countries. Because so much money was being poured into the countries, simple way to put it, if I am spending $1 million to build a factory in Mexico, I expect to get the profit back from that. I spent the money, built the factory, paid the workers. It's my factory. Even though I might live in the U.S., it's in Mexico. Therefore, whatever profits generated from that doesn't stay in Mexico. The profit comes to me. Yeah, the workers down there are getting paid, which is good. They've got jobs and they're getting paid. But the reality is all the profits being generated, all the tax revenue, whatever I can, there wasn't a lot because generally they got agreements to not have to pay taxes. All that was coming back to me. And so all of this money that was being generated from all the goods being sold, it wasn't really staying there. It was going out of the country. So it didn't really benefit the countries that much. The profits were going to England and America and France, for instance. All right. This is sort of what becomes this idea of neocolonialism, the new version of colonialism. Simple way to understand it. If I can't own that colony, if I can't own Mexico, like Spain, for instance, what I'm going to do is make sure that I still get all the profit from it. I'm going to control the trade. I'm going to invest money and own the factories. I'm going to own the farms, own the plantations. I am going to find a way that even if I don't technically have control of the colony or the country, I'm going to continue to get all the profits from it. That's the new form of colonialism, this neo-colonialism. We don't have to be actually your colonial masters anymore, but we are still going to find a way through our dominance of trade and the market economy and militarily if we need to, loans, investments, whatever, I'm still going to find a way to basically suck all the money and profits and revenue out of your country, even if I don't actually own your country anymore. The new form of colonialism. Interesting. Raw materials out and the manufactured goods in. Many cases, they sort of have these deals where they force these countries to buy their goods. They force these countries to buy. These are now independent countries. Many of these countries are independent political states, but they're in these trade deals to where I agree to buy some goods from you, but you have to buy my goods from me. And the thing is, my stuff is more valuable. I'm going to take some natural resources out of your country, but I'm going to then force you to buy all of my manufactured goods, and it's going to be more expensive stuff. So the over-under on it is I'm going to make a much bigger profit margin. Profit margin on raw materials and natural resources is really low, whether it is mined or cut down with trees or grown on a farm. The actual initial production stage of products, where it's still a raw natural resource, either just grown or pulled out of the ground or cut from a tree, really low profit margin. Your profit margins are on the end manufactured good. Profit margins on the original natural resources are sometimes only in the single percentage points. Profit margins on manufactured goods can be 100%, like double price. It may cost you $1 to make it, you can sell it for $2. You're making 100% more than it cost. While you're pulling goods out of the ground, it might cost you $100 to get it out of the ground, you're going to sell it for $110. You're making 10%. So the manufactured goods have an incredibly much higher profit margin. Plus, in Europe, they're also mass-produce the goods because they have factories with all these people in Europe, and there's millions of factories across the continent mass-producing these goods across all different countries. So the profit margins are way, way higher, and so they're making way more profit instead of keeping the money in the countries. It's interesting. And it worked. It obviously worked. It made these European countries incredibly wealthy and powerful. So in many ways, what you find is these countries are in a way still performing, and the reason this says this, similar to colonialism, 1800s, the process is different. To be clear, the process is different. The way the European countries are doing this, and the United States is in on this now, doing this stuff. But ultimately, the end result is the same. raw materials, natural resources being sucked out, and they are then being forced to buy the manufactured goods from European countries or the U.S. Out, in. And the profits generally go primarily on the manufactured goods. Much higher profit margin on the manufactured goods that countries like the United States, Spain, England, France, etc. are making. Portugal, probably. All right, now these vast territories, they had to be inhabited. They often had large plantations. This was common all across Central and South America, these large farms, these large plantations, sometimes slaves, sometimes not, but still lots of poor workers, Again, even if it wasn't slaves, they were basically like serfs, like European serfs. Poor peasant workers tied to the land, no other opportunities, no opportunity to elevate themselves, raise themselves, get educated. There is nothing else they can do. There's literally no other work they can do other than being a forced laborer. There's nothing else. If they have independent small farms, those are purchased and bought up, consolidated into huge farms that cover thousands and tens of thousands of acres. There is literally no option. Either you want to be starving, homeless, living out in the middle of the jungle, but if you actually want to provide something for your family, you actually want to have any money, you actually want to buy anything, you're going to have to basically work on these large plantations that by the late 1800s, about 65%, two-thirds of the entire South American population worked on one of these types of large farms, large plantations like this. Again, mostly not slave, but it's just a step above that. It's basically forced, coerced labor, and you're tied to the land. You have no other options. What else can you do if you want to feed your family? You don't really have other options. Yeah. These large plantations need to be farmed. The natives were often forced into it. Latin American, these social systems, workers on these large landed estates, they were referred to as haciendas, these large estates that encompass hundreds, thousands of acres, would have hundreds or even thousands of workers. Finally, these legal machinations took much of the land from the peasants. As I said, people usually lost their land. They were purchased, they were bought. It was a real common thing we saw up here in North America that we did with the Native Americans, for instance. When we would establish new states or new regions or new territories in North America, we would then go to the Native American population to say, where's your document that you own this land? What, WTF, what do you mean? The Indians have been living there for hundreds or even thousands of years. They don't have a document that says they own the land. And the United States government or the different state governments, including here in California, we would then go to them and say, well, if you don't have a document that says you own this land, you don't own it. It's ours now. We did this in the U.S. to our Native Americans countless times. Mexico did this, their indigenous populations, and all across Central and South America. This was a common thing. The governments, the municipal, judicial authorities would come in and say, where's your proof you own the land? Most people did not. Every once in a while, someone might say, oh, here's a land deed given to me by Spain. We did see a few of those things. And that occasionally might save your land, if you were lucky. But we do also find that in the court rulings, and I kind of can speak for the United States, that in most of these court rulings in California, for instance, when people actually even did have documents that they would say, here's the proof that I own this land, these land deeds, those land deeds, of course, had been assigned by Mexico, when Mexico owned California. And so, say it differently, I actually meant to say Spain, when Spain owned California before Mexican independence. And then many of these governments in Western United States would say, well, we don't recognize Spanish authority. And then later, because California was part of Mexico for about 30 years, I guess, before it declared independence, became part of the U.S., or the U.S. took it over, however you want to put it, they would sometimes have land deeds from Mexico and say, oh, well, this was given to me by Mexico. Most of these cases that went to court, 88, this is a statistics, I don't have it in my notes, but I remember it very well because I talk about it in U.S. history class, but 88% of all those court cases that went into the courts where they said, oh, I have a document here from Mexico saying this is my land or my family's land, they were thrown out and disqualified, and that land was lost. So through all these different ways, people lost their land to the governments, to the local authorities, And what we find is that most of this farmland is industrialized and commercialized, owned by large farmers or corporations or businesses or the government by the late 1800s. So these people had no options. Either they work on this land or they starve. So most of them find themselves working on this land as these laborers. They don't really have a choice. All right. Let's switch gears and talk about Canada a little bit. Canada, from French colony to nation. Empire building, this growth of empire, brought France and England into conflict in North America. France and England were in conflict in this war I've actually mentioned before, the 7 Years' War. This was a precursor to the American Revolution, and it was influential in the American Revolution, but we're not going to talk about that. The 7 Years' War, sometimes what we called, it was also known as the Great War for Empire. This is basically England's attempt to dominate globally, all across the world, from Asia to the Americas. And they win pretty much everywhere they go. They win pretty much every conflict. It's devastating to their economy. It increases their national debt like 4 times. One of the reasons they tax the United States so much, or they tax the colonies so much, one of the reasons the colonies started saying no taxation without representation, which leads to the revolution. So this war causes increased taxes, which actually leads to the American Revolution. So everything's tied together. So the 7 Years' War, which occurs big part in North America, brings England and France into conflict. The eastern part of North America, the eastern side of it, was a slender area, and that was controlled by England. Most of the central North America was controlled by France. English wanted that. They especially wanted the regions in Canada where the Great Lakes were and where the rivers were. They wanted to control the rivers because if you control the rivers, you could control the trade routes. So England wanted controlling the rivers, wanted to control the Great Lakes region, all of that region, which most of that is in Canada or borders Canada, and was all French territory. England wanted it. Again, trade and money. That's really what it's all about. So this was all what was called New France. This was all parts of New France. Now the war ends, and in this treaty, England gets much of it. They get much of this New France. The population was sparse. It was basically fur traders and Catholic missionaries trying to convert the population unsuccessfully, I might add. Jesuits. The 7 Years' War between England and France was contested in the New World all across the globe. Of course, we called it the French and Indian War here in the U.S. Put the French and Indians together. They were allies. Don't be confused by the name of the French and Indian War. It's kind of interesting how it says that way, but the French and Indians were allies against the British. And we were part of England at the time. The colonies were part of England. So basically it was the French and Indians versus the American colonists. French Indians against the American colonies, which were part of England. Great Britain ends the French Empire in North America. The treaty in 1763, which makes New France part of England. Here's the problem. There ain't no British people in New France. New France is almost exclusively Native Americans and French. And truthfully, it's mostly Native Americans. And so we have a huge chunk of North America, which is now part of the British Empire, because France lost this part of the war, but it doesn't want to be part of the British Empire. There's hardly any British people there. The people who are in authority are the French. Complicated. You've got thousands of French and hundreds of thousands of Indians being ruled by England, which is on the other side of the ocean. It wasn't really us. We didn't rule New France. It wasn't us. We were ruled by England, the American colonies. They didn't really do anything for us, truthfully. Now, the British Parliament passes the Quebec Act. This gave religious rights to French Canadians, specifically to make it easier to rule them. Because, remember, England was Protestant. England was Anglican, the Anglican Church. Protestant Church. The French are Catholic. Protestants and Catholics have spent centuries killing each other. So here, that's another aspect. We have a Protestant government running a bunch of Catholic French people. Hatred all across the board. Every direction. For a variety of reasons. So one of the things English agree is we are going to be religiously tolerant. We're not going to expect people to convert to Protestantism. You get to continue worshiping Catholicism and be Catholics. Go ahead and be your Catholics, and we'll leave it alone. Religious tolerance. Okay, good. Now, they did not go all the way, though. They denied we don't want to call them Canadians yet. We'll call them the French in Quebec, I guess, the Quebec region. They denied them government. They wanted their own government. Basically what they wanted is, we've talked about before, home rule. Home rule is where you are technically ruled by a country somewhere else, but you get to sort of rule things on your own with independence. That's the idea of home rule. We are part of the British Empire, all hail the Queen, but we get to sort of run ourselves. They didn't get that. They wanted that. That's what they asked for. That doesn't happen yet. They do eventually get that, but not yet. Which continues to create more problems and strife and more anger and frustration as you got all these French Catholics, they're ruled by the British Protestants, and they're allowed to worship without being attacked or whatever, but they're not really allowed any type of independence. And bear in mind, these French Catholics in North America, they never really consider themselves part of the British Empire. Now, today, but back then they did not really consider themselves part of the British Empire at all. They didn't have a choice in the matter. This was a decision made over in Paris, and Versailles. They made that decision. They never, not like they consulted the French citizens up here in North America. Be like, hey, do you guys think you want to be part of the British Empire? Yeah, like they had any say in the matter. All right, so the British Parliament does this, gives them religious tolerance, denies them any type of government, no representation. There was a single British governor, again, who owed allegiance to the British crown. All right, the Revolutionary War happened, 1776 to 17... It's really over by 81, but I think technically it goes to 83. The war is over by 81, but really I think 83 is sort of when it officially ends, 76 to 83. And so the war sort of ends. We see thousands of British people moving to Canada. Why? The revolution's over. America has won its independence, and yet there's still tens of thousands of Brits who live in the colonies. Again, where did all the colonial people came from? Other than the slaves and the very small percentage of Native Americans, everyone else in the colonies was British. Primarily, yeah, there's a few other people in there, but 90%. British or descended from Brits. So there are tens of thousands of British loyalists in the colony, people who are first generation or not, and they're loyal. And are they going to sail across the ocean back to England? No. They came here in the first place because they didn't want to be in England. So they go to Canada. They go to Canada, which actually makes Canada much more British. By 1800, we're probably approximately even between British and French citizens, or British and French people. They're all English citizens, actually, but we have a large number of British people, British Protestants, and you have the Catholic French primarily. Quite a few. So now we see English government change. We see the English government's opinion change of Canada now that it is full of many British citizens, actual British people. We see it change completely. England slowly extends home rule to Canada. We have the Constitution Act of 1791, creates a legislature. We see other changes that come after that. They're wanting to avoid a situation like what happens in America, like what happens in the United States. They want to avoid a situation where the people in Canada sort of rise up and overthrow and declare independence. England wants to make it much more part of England, allowing them to have rule, authority, constitution. Eventually they're able to form their own legislature, their own full government, really wanting to hope that it will basically allow them to be independent, but still owing allegiance to the British crown. And because you have many, many people in authority there who are British, and are the people who are French, who have no opportunity to, they're not going to go back to France, they're not going to be part of the French Empire again, they're generally okay with it because England is still ruling sort of in the European style. Let's see what else we have. Where else we want to look at here? New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are join Ontario and Quebec, and these 4 regions together end up forming what we call this Dominion of Canada. Dominion of Canada formed in 1876. This Dominion government pretty much controls all domestic affairs, while England controls foreign affairs. And this is what we end up finding. We're not going to mention it here exactly, but what becomes known as the Commonwealth, just referred to as the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth. It does, by the mid-1900s, come to incorporate about 1/4 of all countries in the world. Not necessarily landmass, but about 1/4 of all countries in the world eventually come to be under the British Commonwealth. Almost all these countries have independent home rule. They control all their own domestic affairs. That's your issues actually inside your country, your domestic laws, policies, etc. Pretty much you run within your country. But all your international affairs, all your foreign affairs, your relations with other countries, military things outside your country, etc., are handled by the central government in England, the British government. So domestic affairs, internal, home rule, and external foreign affairs, international affairs are usually handled by England, the royalty, the king, the crown, the prime minister, the parliament, all in England. And so these together form this Dominion of Canada in 67, sorry. All right, we have the American Civil War, which occurs around the same time period, 60 to 65. Canada develops a centralized government. They're again fearing a similar issue, a similar situation. Canada sort of learning from what happens in the colonies with the fear of the different states, because that's really what the American Civil War was about states' rights versus federal rights. The right that was most important, although there was lots of other things that we're talking about, but the one that was most important was the issue of slavery. But really the greater issue was about economy. That's the reason the Southerners wanted to hold on to the slavery. They believed losing slavery would damage the economy and damage their pocketbook. It wasn't that they wanted to keep the slaves, although some people probably did. It wasn't about the slaves. It was about what they represented. They were literally dollar signs. Losing slavery, thought many people in the South would lose their economic power and the economic authority of the South because it was largely built upon slavery. But it's the states' rights to control their own economy, control their own business. Well, Canada feared the same kind of thing. Slavery wasn't an issue. But they still feared that these independent states, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, that they might come to challenge each other because there was this issue of states' authority versus a national government. But there was a second issue that some of these regions were primarily British, Protestant, and some of these regions were primarily French Catholic. And there was also a concern about internal conflicts, literally a civil war over religion. Not unheard of. Matter of fact, it had happened in Europe over and over and over, wars over religion. And so there was even this concern about potential religious warfare happening. It was actually already happening in England between the Irish and the British. That had been going on for a while. So there was this worry about this kind of thing. And so what they do to sort of deal with this is they try to form a central government which has authority over all of the regions of this Dominion of Canada, and takes away most of the power from the local authority. So most of the power to make any decisions becomes very clear in the Constitution of Canada that almost all the power is focused within the central government. And the states, these different states, have very limited power. The U.S. was different. Our Constitution actually said the opposite. The Constitution said this, and this are central power, and as one of the amendments says, which I think it's the 10th Amendment, I believe it's the 10th Amendment, it says any powers not reserved to the federal government in the Constitution are given to the states. And since the federal government is only given very limited powers in the Constitution, what our Constitution basically says is there's a few things the federal government does, and everything else is left to the states. That's basically what our Constitution says, simply. Today it's sort of reversed in practice today, but at the time of the founding, all the power was supposed to be with the states. Well, Canada was worried about that. They wanted to make it very clear in their constitution that all the power was with the central government. And the states had very limited powers because they wanted to avoid the Civil War or something similar type of thing as we had here. Let's see what happens here. We do see, if I want to include what else. So between 68 and 73, we see Canada expand across the continent, creating new provinces, states, as we think of states. And it does form, by the end of the century, by the 1890s, one of the largest countries in the world, encompassing all of North America, the entire North America from sea to sea. Still sparsely populated, though. Very sparsely populated. Other than a few urban regions, the vast majority of it was practically empty. Immigration increases during the 1890s from across the globe. Most entered Canada's Central Plains, and it develops into the largest grain region in the entire world. And by 1900, 90% of all Canadians were in agriculture. But bear in mind, this isn't the same kind of agriculture we see in Central and South America or Africa or Asia. This is not poverty agriculture. Most of these are independent farmers. That's how farming was in the U.S. In this time period. Most farmers were independent small farmers in the late 1800s. That changes in the early 1900s. But in the late 1800s, most of them are these smaller independent farmers. And so what we see in Canada, it becomes the breadbasket of the Western Hemisphere, where most of this wheat and grain was actually being produced out of central Canada, which was prime land, apparently, for growing that. And most Canadians became involved in farming. Now, agrarian doesn't mean you're a farmer. Most agrarians are farmers, but what agrarian means is the entire rural farming lifestyle. You might live in a local town, you might work on farm animals or farm implements, you might run a general store. It's the entire sort of rural agrarian life. It's based, and the core of it is the farmers, but it's everything around it. It's like a spokes of a wheel. It's all the stuff around it that are all associated with the farmers, all the places where they sell their products, they get all their products from, all the ancillary businesses, this whole life, which makes basically Canada a big farm, a big agricultural society is really what it becomes by the 1890s. While the U.S. is going the opposite direction. The U.S. is actually moving away from the agricultural, even though, don't get me wrong, much of the U.S. is still farmland, especially in the central region. But we're sort of moving a little bit away from that by the 1890s, and we are moving fully industrialization. By the early 1900s, we are the largest, most prosperous industrial nation on the earth, probably by 1914, the time of the World War. We are probably the most industrialized, not militarized, but most industrialized nation on the globe, probably. Canada stays the other direction. They don't need to. First of all, Canada doesn't have to worry about building a huge military infrastructure or worry about that kind of thing because England protects them. They're part of the Commonwealth. They're part of this great empire, this global spanning empire that protects them. If Canada gets in trouble, certainly they have their own military, but it's really small. If Canada gets into real trouble, they call the Brits, and England ships over soldiers and stuff. So they're really, they're part of the British Empire. They don't stand alone. We stood alone. The United States, we had lots of business partners, people we worked with, England for one, but we weren't technically allies. If we went to war, there isn't suddenly a bunch of English ships are going to sail up and help us. We're on our own. It's just interesting how the parallels and the differences, the comparison, how's the contrast and comparisons between how Canada develops and the U.S. develops. There's certain ways that they are very similar, and certain ways they diverge very much. Canada here, different regions. 1867 shows when it becomes this Dominion of Canada. It's a huge area. It's massive. But most of it is sparsely inhabited. Very much so. Good to look at. All right. Australia. Australia's interesting. Prisoners. That was the basis of Australia's founding, was as a prison colony. We had some here in the U.S. too. Georgia, for instance. Georgia was originally founded as a penal colony by the English. They thought it was much better to ship their prisoners over here to the Americas and make them work over here as indentured servants, which is what many British people came over initially, was indentured servants, which is a form of slavery. And they would ship them over, they would sign them into contracts, they're prisoners, and ship them over here as indentured servants to work the farmland, to work the plantations over here in the Americas. Interesting. All right. So we have English explorer James Cook. He landed and he claims Australia in 1770. He claims it for the motherland, England. Claims it for the British Empire. He was unimpressed with the flatland, the native population known as the Aborigines. Unimpressed with them. There were approximately 300,000. These are approximate numbers. Approximately 300,000 at the time he lived there. A hunter-gatherer society. Prehistoric. They were Stone Age. Bows, arrows. They had limited or maybe no contact with any modern society. Now, I don't know what the most current scholarship on this, but as of, scholarship 10, 15 years ago, their belief was they'd had zero contact with outside peoples. Entirely isolated from the rest of the world forever. I mean, there are places even in the last century in Pacific Islands that have been thought to have been their very first contact. Very first contact. Their Pacific Islands, just in the 1900s, have the first contact with anyone outside their island ever in tens of thousands of years. This was a very isolated place. This Australia region was. It was far from anywhere else. Prehistoric weapons. They were not warriors, though. There was no warfare. Their weapons were used almost exclusively for hunting. There was little to no evidence of warfare or violence in their society. Well, at least till the Europeans showed up. No development of agriculture. That's another thing. So that would put them in a situation basically prehistoric, the way you put this. History really begins 3,000 BCE, 5,000 years ago, to 7,000 years ago, the beginning of agriculture and cities. Agriculture probably dates back 10,000 years, give or take. It's an approximate. But really we see the beginning of history when we talk about the beginning of cities and some type of written language or written literature or culture, something that can actually be dated, which puts us back around 3,000 BCE, give or take, 5,000 years ago. This had no written language, no written culture. They did not do farming. This is a society that probably looked exactly like it did in 1770 as it might have looked in 10,000 BC. Nothing had seemed to change, we think. It was, it would have been a, what do you call it, anthropologists? I don't know if they even had those back then, but it would have been an anthropologist's dream to find this society in this time period. They didn't care about it, though. The Brits didn't care about it. The Brits were there to claim land and find a way to exploit it. Find a way to exploit the land and the natural resources. Most die. 90% of the population die over the next century due to disease, abuse, exploitation, and enforced slavery by the British colonists. This is what they saw in the time period, though. In 1770, what did the British people see in this time period? They were basically slave traders. We see slavery. We see enforced indentured servitude of their own British citizens. In 1770, it would have been common for the British citizens to be put into basically forced slavery as indentured servants and then shipped to the colonies to work on the farms until they died. Indentured servitude. So they would have thought nothing. It would have not even been a thought about basically forcing these Aborigines, these indigenous populations, to work on the farms, the mines, the plantations. They would have never even thought twice about it. It would have simply been expected at the time period for the Europeans to treat what they would have considered inferior peoples like this. Wouldn't have even hesitated to do this. where he lands, and he then moves on from. He doesn't stay there. It's eventually called Botany Bay. All kinds of new. The reason it's called this is botany, the science of studying plants, is because there were so many new plant forms discovered. Australia had been probably disconnected from mainland, the rest of the world, for maybe 50,000 or more years. So the plant life and animal life which developed on Australia was unique. Much of it looked nothing like anything else found in the world. Certainly a fish looks like a fish, but different types of fish. A lizard looks like a lizard. Bird looks like a bird, but the entirely different looking birds, different looking lizards, different looking animals. It was a island, or it's a continent, giant island, which had basically been disconnected from the rest of the world for, who knows, tens and tens of thousands of years, maybe even 250,000 years or longer. Entirely unique. And so there was just countless new types of species, plants, and animals they came to identify that they'd never seen or ever seen anything like before. This becomes a penal colony, an island prison. He sends back, this is a great place to send our prisoners. We'll force them to work here and force them to basically improve the land and try and make it a better place. Try and make it a profitable colony some way or another. Hundreds, eventually thousands, eventually tens of thousands of prisoners. They couldn't send them to Georgia anymore. American independence, so they sent them over here to Botany Bay. Most were men, but over a while they realized they needed women, so they started sending over female prisoners, or actually prostitutes, that they would pick up off the streets in England, in London. They would tell them they were going to be taken somewhere better, or they would be paid off, or bribed. Then they'd be put on ships, locked on the ships, and transported across the world. And they would show up here in Australia, and there were hundreds of women, and they were basically used as concubines to populate the continent, to populate Australia. It's pretty bad. Don't get me wrong, it was bad for everybody. The men it was bad for, their prisoners. It was really... A lot of it was very barbaric, a lot of very violent. Women were mistreated, the men were mistreated. The jailers were actually prisoners themselves, because they were on the island permanently. No one came back. When they got shipped to Australia, rarely did anyone ever leave the continent. I have a hard time calling it a continent. It is, but I have time calling it that. But anyway, very few people ever left. So even the jailers basically became prisoners. And we see very shortly intermixing of the population. The prisons are opened up, and basically the prisoners run the asylum. The prisoners, the jailers intermix. The women that are brought there are basically used to breed new populations. They're expected to basically reproduce, and it becomes a very unique society, disconnected from the whole rest of the world. Sometimes they go years without ships showing up. It's very interesting. They manage to find a way to survive, to actually be successful and actually grow some crops, use animals, sheep, and actually find a way to prosper and make a living and make a home out of it. But it is very rough for decades. Let's see. They were used basically as slave labor, all for the benefit of the population, for the benefit of England and the potential. It didn't generate anything. For decades, it was really very little profit. But eventually, they do find products and goods that are profitable that they can sell, harvest, and manufacture there. Wool, gold, there you go. All right, so eventually, by 1790s, let me get the date right. By the 1790s to the 1820s, we start seeing free settlers showing up. As the news starts to get back that there's a new world, a new world. The new world of the Americas was old now. People have been going to the new world in the Americas for 200 years. This is the new world. A new frontier, a new place to go, strike it rich, start all over, build a business, build an empire. A whole new... Now, no one really understood. No one had actually circumnavigated the continent yet. No one quite understood how big it was at the time. Initially, Cook thought it was just a large island. Turned out, of course, to be much, much bigger than that. So, once the word gets out about how big it is and how far it stretches, and people start sailing around and coming back with stories a year later, finally getting around, they're like, oh my God, this place is massive. It's huge. People get an idea of how big it is, and news gets around the world, and we start seeing by the 18-teens, 1820s, 1830s, we start seeing hundreds and then thousands of settlers coming in by choice, free settlers. It's no longer really a penal colony. And we start seeing production ramp up of wool, and then, of course, gold is discovered. And then that changes everything when gold is discovered. So the best opportunity initially was to raise sheep, because it's a very harsh environment, but sheep did very well. Remember, one of England's largest enterprises and industries was textiles. So sheep produce wool, wool produces clothes. So people find that you can basically create a large sheep farm and sell the wool and become wealthy, become rich off of it, selling all the wool from the sheep. So now we find Australia quickly becoming covered with large sheep ranches, encompassing hundreds and then thousands of acres of land, sheep farming. And the more and more they went out, and the more and more they spread, they start to find other things. Eventually they find gold. Eventually, later, they find oil and other things there as well. Now, when gold happens, everything changes. You're aware, probably, in California we have the gold rush, the miner 49ers. The reason they're called the 49ers, San Francisco 49ers, is that is when gold is discovered up by Sacramento, Sutter's Mill. We got this gold discovered when we have this huge gold rush to California. About 500,000 people come here over the next 18 months. Let me see, what's the number? Close to 500,000. Close to 500,000 people come here over the next 2 years after this. We see them coming from across the ocean, across the continent, from everywhere, all flocking to California, coming here to the gold rush, hoping to strike it rich. Ultimately, we end up with, give or take, 200,000 people coming in and around the San Francisco, Sacramento area all during this 2-year period. A lot of them don't ever make it to that region. A lot of them come to California and just have farms and other things as well. Well, why do I mention that? Because when the gold rush ends in 50-51, when basically the gold strikes stop coming in, people stop discovering new gold mines, new gold regions, they're panning for gold and they're not finding any. Basically all of the obvious gold was found or had been claimed. The land had been claimed. All the obvious stuff. Suddenly they find out there's gold in Australia. And we have tens of thousands of people hopping on ships all around the world, sailing to Australia for the next big gold rush. And it's huge. This dramatic population increase, people coming here looking for gold from all around the world. California's gold rush coming here, but they come from everywhere. We have people from Peru, we have people from Brazil, we have people from Europe, we have people from Asia, Chinese, a lot of Chinese, Asian people. Hello there. How you doing? That's my puppy. She came over to say hi. It really increases dramatically, and by 1860, the population of Australia has quadrupled from 1850. 4-time increase in a decade. Now, in America, what happens when the gold dries up? When people can't find gold finds anymore, the mines are all claimed. What do most of those extra people become? The majority of them become wheat farmers. Today, in all the vineyard areas in Northern California, all the places where all the wine vineyards are up there north of Frisco, all that region, Napa Valley and all that, initially, all of that was wheat farms, as far as the eye could see. Wheat farms in every direction. I don't know when it switched over to wine. I don't know that. Here, what happens over time is a lot of these, when the gold rush pans out, most of these people end up becoming farmers or sheep farmers, agricultural farmers, sheep farmers, things like that. Let's see what else we have going on here. This gold and wool becomes the foundation for the Australian economy. Technology and industry become vital. Of course, you got to have railroads and roads, and you got to have industrial vehicles, and you got to have industries and farms, and you got to have factories. This becomes an industrialized society pretty quickly. Its bottom line is all the money. There was so much money generated by all of this happening here that they were able to really quickly build a large, industrial, successful society. Masses of population, a lot of money generated. You have a great workforce. It allows the continent to quickly industrialize. And, it doesn't do as quickly as like we talked about Japan. It does not like overnight industrialized. But over the next 100 years or so, it becomes quite industrialized. And, of course, it is still part of the British Crown. It is still given the protection of the British Empire, so they have that covered. And it becomes a entirely white-dominated society. We will talk a little more about that, but it becomes entirely white and segregated society with white dominance. Let's see. Job opportunities begin to attract laborers from various parts of the world. Japanese, Chinese, South American, Afghanistan, Middle Eastern, Indian. We do see people from all across the world coming here. It is the new frontier, and there's a lot of wealth being generated. And as more and more people come to realize how big it is, the idea is simple. It's everywhere. You literally just got to go there and go in some direction and go 100 miles and just keep going until there's no more farmers and stake or claim. There is ample territory that has been unclaimed. So people from all across the world, immediately it becomes a very racist society. The whites were there first. The whites established the government, part of the British Empire, and we see immediate racial discrimination, segregation, the white British descendants versus everyone else. And it's a lot of everyone else. By 1850s, 1860, I guess, let me see if I had the date in here. 1890, sorry. I was just off the top of my head. By 1890s, the population is about half white and half everyone else. So we have a very diverse population that is not even a majority white. It's actually a majority minority. It's a majority of people who are not white. But the whites were there first. They established it. It's part of the British Empire, and it becomes basically a white racist society, very prejudicial society. People of color were often targeted for discrimination, prejudicial attacks. The Aborigine tribes, of course, were almost entirely wiped out, over a 90% loss of the Aborigines. We see anti-Asian sentiment, of course. There were quite a few Americans that went here, too, it should be noted. A lot of Americans left California after the gold rush and went to Australia to try to strike it rich. We see Americans leading a lot of a push of racist, because racism, of course, was standard and typical in the U.S., against Africans as a country, but especially in the West Coast, a lot of anti-Asian sentiment was very common on the West Coast, California, in the western United States, from California up to Seattle. Very much, you go to the southern states in the U.S., the racism is usually anti-black, but on the West Coast, it was anti-Asian, anti-Chinese. We see that a lot after the gold rush. They brought a lot of that with them, although the Brits already had that in the first place. This leads to a whites-only policy, and we don't actually see these whites-only policies of Canada really changing until the 1970s, 100 years later, till we start seeing more racial openness. It becomes a very discriminatory racist society for a white supremacist society for pretty much the following century. Not really changing until modern times. Not really changing until my lifetime, actually. So basically, my lifetime, we really start seeing Australia move away from a white supremacist society. It could be said it was even worse, probably, even though there was no technical slavery. There was technically no slavery in Australia, really, ever. Initially, many people were treated like that. The idea of this white supremacy and the white dominance and the white authority becomes ingrained into the culture even further, or even beyond what happened in the United States. It's interesting. What do we want to see here on this? We see Australia, Western Plateau, the different regions. We're going to talk more about government coming up next. We're going to talk about sort of how the government forms, and how the government is associated, and how this sort of becomes a country. We haven't even talked about the politics yet. That's coming up next. Let's see what we want to talk about there. I love how they named one of the communities they named Darwin. That's good. I like that. Down here, I don't think there's necessarily anything else we need to talk about. You can obviously look at the map. Oh, I don't want to cover up. Don't want to cover up the New Zealand. Is that the that's the Kiwis, right? I know they're called Kiwis. Okay, move on to this. The life of immigration puzzle, I think, is interesting. So, what kind of British aspirations does this give you? If you're a lower middle class, again, not an entirely poverty-stricken peasant, but if you have an actual opportunity to elevate yourself, if you are lower middle class, you have a modicum of education, you have a little bit of opportunity, you're not from an entirely destitute family, and you might actually have a chance of elevating your status. What opportunities might Australia give you? Think about that. What opportunities, if you are someone who has at least some means, lower middle class, some opportunity, education, a little bit of money, what opportunities does Australia present to you? The possibilities, economically, provide for your family, kids, business, the future. Think about all that. Think about that. Private land ownership. If you actually lived in England, not many people had private land. Not many people had independent private. Again, your average typical poor person in England worked in a factory, and that was the majority of the population. So you didn't usually own land. You were a renter, an apartment person. You were a tenant. What is known more technically as a tenant. Whether you are a tenant farmer, a tenant in a city, you don't own your land, you don't own your labor, you don't own your home. That's the majority of people. So what opportunities did Australia offer them? Think about all this stuff. I've given you a lot of that. Think about all the things that could happen if you go to Australia, the opportunities that could arise, the ways you could provide for your family, either staying in Australia and building a life there, or staying for a few years and owning a farm, or owning sheep and maybe generating wealth and maybe going back to England, or going back to one of the other 50 colonies England had. Again, if you had some means, we're not talking about rich or wealthy, but if you could afford a ticket on a ship, you could literally go anywhere in the world and find British land. You could go to the Americas, Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia. You could go anywhere in the world and find somewhere that the Brits had a colony. And you could stake your claim and start a whole new life. If you could get the money for a ticket on a ship. Or maybe enough money for your family if you have a family. But if you were a young single man, literally the world was open for you. If you could just work for a few years to get enough money to buy a ticket on a ship. Which even a poor person, if they saved their money for a couple years, they could buy a ship ticket. You could literally go anywhere in the world and start a whole new life still on British soil, under the British Empire, under the British government, which gives you a sense of safety and security. You're going to be where other British people are. You're going to technically be still part of the British Empire, protected by the British military, even in the far corners of the world. Immigration. I haven't said that yet. There's two types of immigration. There's immigration with I, immigration with an E. It's easy to remember. I for in, E for exit. So immigration I is when you're coming into a place. Immigration E is when you're exiting a place. You're leaving. So this is the life of immigration. This is basically a little puzzle here about leaving and going to the world. Leaving England and going out into the world. As an independent young man, to start a family, to start all over, to start a new life, to strike it rich, to start a career, an empire. And you always had that option of going and making your wealth and your status somewhere and making your name, and then coming back to England and then going back to the mother country and starting there. And you went and made money in Australia for 10 years, come back, buy a home, buy a farm, be an independent businessman back in the home country. Or, of course, you could stay wherever you went. Start a family. Or you could send money back to your family in England. The opportunities and options are endless. This was a real unique opportunity that very few people in the world had. Even other European countries which laid claim to different places in the world, most of them had 1 or 2 big colonies in places in the world. England had dozens. Every continent, there were English colonies. You could go and start all over again, and you were still sort of at home, if you will. So think about the opportunities and why this life of immigration, and look at the different images. Look at all the different things it shows, the places where you could go, things you could do, the jobs, the shipping, the farm work, the animals, starting a new farm, starting a new life, going and discovering new lands, new territories. So think about why this was such a big deal for England. Now let's look at the other aspect of it. Why did England want you to move? Why did the English Empire want you to pack your shit up from England and hop on a boat and go somewhere else in the world? It should be obvious, right? I don't want to give it all to you, in case this is a question I put somewhere. Think about all the reasons why England wants you to pack up your stuff, hop on a ship, and go to one of their colonies in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia. Why do they want you to do that? Obviously, a lot of reasons, right? I could tell you all of them, but I want you to be thinking about it. There's economic. There's industrial. There's all kinds of reasons. There's military reasons. A lot of people chose to do that. Put on a military uniform, become a world traveler, go and protect and go to all the different colonies in the world. You as a soldier might find yourself in your career, if you spent 20 or 30 years in the British military, you might find yourself spending time on every single continent. Now, it's a little more dangerous than being a settler. Maybe not. As a settler, do you have soldiers standing there protecting you every day? No, you're often on your own on the frontier, dealing with the native populations, animals, dealing with other criminals. You're often, as a soldier, or often as a frontier person, you are on your own. Sometimes no assistance, miles from anyone else. So yeah, being on the frontier, being a pioneer was very dangerous and risky. The rewards were great. It was very lucrative. High risk, high reward. So yeah, there's a reason that they would have built this, or they would have created this life of immigration puzzle. And of course, look at the puzzle pieces. This is something meant for kids. There's 30 or 40 puzzle pieces. This is meant for young. This is meant for a young child to be looking at and say, wow, when I grow up, look at all the things I could do. Look at all the opportunities out there as part of the British Empire. Look at all the opportunities I have. Literally limitless opportunities. If you've got the courage, you got the guts to do it. The British Empire wanted you to do this. They needed people in those colonies. They wanted you to go. They encouraged you to go. They even offered, there's times they offered the tickets free or discounted, or they offered the land free or discounted. Very interesting. And there's a lot to really think about this and things that I haven't talked about. But I want you to think about some of it and come up with some ideas and thoughts about why this was so important and what the significance of it is, and why does England basically want to get rid of you? You know? How does it benefit them? Because it did benefit them. All right, now I think this is the last of it. This is the end of it here. So, the shaping of government and a national identity. All right. So the Australian Colonies Government Act. It's a good name. Australian Colonies Government Act. This was actually from England. England, remember, this is sort of before Australia is really a country exactly. It's still really just a British colony. So all their laws and policies, act is a law, are all being written by the English Parliament. So until they really become independent and have home rule, their laws and policies are all decided by English Parliament all the way back in England. They allowed the foremost populous colonies, these foremost populous colonies, to have home rule. They established their own legislatures, their own voting rights, and they formed their own constitutions. And we end up with these 4 different regions, these 4 different sort of colonies, as noted here on the map. we get these different Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and there it is. New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria. It's a little bit later. We have West, South, and then West Australia, South Australia, and Queens. So we end up with eventually, what is that, about 6 regions? So initially we have the 4 established, which I don't have the names of those right here in my notes, but the map pretty much tells you what they are. Queensland, Australia, Victoria. Yeah, it gives you an idea what we're talking about. So initially we have these 4 colonies. The voting system in South Australia, for instance, features universal male suffrage. Every adult male could cast a secret ballot. What we would call a vote today is a secret ballot. 1902, Australia becomes one of the first countries to allow women to vote. Of course, we don't allow that here in America until 1920. Easy to remember. I'm not even going to say it right now, but yeah, the 19th Amendment. There's a whole little thing, easy to remember. But yeah, we don't actually give women the right to vote till 1920 here in the United States. As a country, we have certain parts of the U.S. that give women the right to vote all the way back in the 1860s, like Wyoming, for instance, I think gives women the right to vote in 1869, 67, 69. But as a country, we don't do that till, 20 years after Australia does. Now, why do they do this? They probably do this for the same exact reason we did in the U.S. Why many of the Western states gave women the right to vote? To draw women there. Because if the women came, women rarely went anywhere by themselves. So if a woman comes to the Western United States, or in this case, a woman comes to South Australia, most likely, she's bringing a family with her. So she's going to bring a husband, kids. So you get one woman, but you actually get like 5 or 6 people. That's the idea, to populate. They want to populate the empty territories. People show up, businesses show up, taxes are generated, more people show up, and it becomes this circular thing. So that's probably one of the reasons they give women the right to vote. England has not even given women the right to vote. England doesn't give women the right to vote until the 1920s, I believe, after we do. This is quite interesting. One of the first places to allow women to vote. In 1921, we get the Commonwealth of, 1901, we get the Commonwealth of Australia formed, making this territory a new nation. We get a parliamentary form of government. They get a decentralized government. They go the opposite direction. They go the opposite direction of the United States, the opposite direction of Canada, because we talked about Canada. They go the opposite direction of Canada. Canada fearing a type of a war like the U.S. had as decentralized, they form a very central government. Australia goes opposite and forms a very decentralized government. Very decentralized, which is actually a copy of the United States, which the United States had actually formed a very decentralized government. Today, it's opposite. Today, our society has really become more of a central federal government. But our Constitution will be very decentralized. So basically, all the power was held in this. Australia follows that model, where pretty much all was being held by the states, these different states. New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria, West Australia, South Australia, and Queens. They form what is thought to be at the time probably the most democratic government in the world. Very white, prejudiced, racist, white supremacist society, but as far as the government goes, probably the most democratic government on the globe, probably, at least large government, large country. It's really interesting how much of these 2 regions we've spent a lot of time talking about here, Canada and Australia, are influenced by the U.S. We are an example, for both good and bad, of what to do and not to do regarding government for the world, for many countries. There are numerous countries in the world. I remember reading a statistic years ago in school that as many as 50 different countries in the world have constitutions that are based on our Constitution. Basically, they're constitutions that are modeled on the U.S. Constitution. Our original Constitution was really powerful because it didn't do much. Think about that. Why was our Constitution so powerful at that time period? Because it didn't actually do much. It basically established a very basic framework and then left everything else sort of ambivalent. ambiguous. Ambiguous is the word I think I'm looking for. It left most of it undecided, to be decided later, to be interpreted later, which many people thought was very useful for a fledgling government. You want the basics, you want the basic structure, but then you want all the rest of it to sort of be decided as we come to it, which is really what our Constitution created, which is very useful. Today, we find it sort of problematic because of that ambiguity in the Constitution that basically leaves our American Constitution largely open to interpretation. And that is why one of the most powerful parts of our government today is judicial. Basically, the judicial branch of our U.S. government's job is pretty much to interpret the Constitution. And that's what they do full-time, 365 days a year. Our full judicial government, a lot more than the Supreme Court, but all of our judicial. Basically, their job, our entire court system, is to basically interpret the Constitution. Because it is so ambiguous. Almost all of it. It's powerful in one way and very frustrating in another way. But most of the time it's good because it allows you to change with the times. Most of the time. And so their society was largely based on the United States government. And their racism was also probably largely based on the United States, unfortunately. That is it for this section. Thanks for going through it with me. It's been quite fun, quite interesting. And we will see you next time.